So, without further ado, on to the first panel, which is you've been talking about society and law. And our three panellists are my colleague Dr. Joe Hunt from Cardiff University School of Law and Politics. Speaking for Remain, Dr. Hwyl Cerry-Jones, Wales Centre Europe. And speaking for Leave, David Rowlands, AM, a newly elected AM for South Wales East. So, I could invite first of all Joe to come and address you.
So good evening everybody, and welcome to the event, and welcome to the Society and Law panel. In a short while we're going to hear from the different sides in the debate on some of the merits and demerits of the UK's participation in a framework of EU laws. And it's a framework which could, on the one hand, be depicted as a straitjacket, restricting the UK's abilities to pursue policies that it sees as being in its own best interests. But on the other, it could also be seen as giving added value, enabling the UK to work closely with other countries and create binding solutions to common challenges. Now, before we hear some of the arguments, I want to say a little something about the nature of EU law from a UK and from a Welsh perspective, and to take the opportunity to point you in the direction of research that's been undertaken by myself and by others as part of the UK in a Changing Europe initiative. And dotted around the room you'll see some brochures from the initiative, a range of factual, academic, objective accounts of the issues at stake in the referendum. So please feel free to take those brochures with you. And also to visit the UK in a Changing Europe website, where you'll find a whole host of resources. And also, coming back to Wales specifically, at Cardiff, we're publishing a series of policy briefs looking specifically at the EU and Wales, at what EU membership means and what a Brexit could mean legally and in policy terms for Wales. And we're looking at areas such as trade, the environment, regional policy. Now, if you're interested in those, then please sign up. There's a sign-up list for the WCIA, and also if you're interested in receiving the brochure, the reports, sign up there as well, please. So just a brief introduction to EU law, what it is that we mean when we talk about EU law, and how it's made. EU law is made under the EU treaties. The treaties, and there are two of them, are international agreements made between the participating states, the 28 member states of the European Union. They write the rules of the game in the treaties. And these treaties set out the scope for action. And the institutions that are given powers to act and to adopt laws can only act where they've been given the power to act under the treaties. So where they've been given the competence. Now, the institutions can then work together to make common rules, to make legislation. We hear a lot about the Commission's role. The Commission, the executive, the administrative arm of the institutions, and it has a key role in proposing legislation. But legislation will also need the approval of the elected members of the European Parliament, as well as the agreement of member states' government ministers when they meet in the Council. And we have, over the past number of years, seen an increasing role for national parliaments to feed into the process of lawmaking. They are now able to flag their concerns as a formal challenge for their involvement, a formal channel for their involvement in EU lawmaking. And these powers that national parliaments have will be strengthened a little following the February renegotiation package David Cameron reached with the partners in Europe. And the Welsh Assembly can and has contributed to that process, feeding in to the UK Parliament's line before the Commission. And more generally, the Welsh Assembly and government has various channels to feed into lawmaking and in determining the UK's line. Once adopted, some EU laws automatically take effect. Most often we see this in the area of agriculture or in competition law, but others will need activating in the national legal order through a piece of national law. And here we might be talking about employment law measures, about environmental rules or consumer protection measures, or the rights for EU workers and others to reside in other EU states, as well as limitations on those rights. And again, here, Wales may be involved in implementing those measures itself, depending on the area and whether or not that area has been devolved to Wales under the Wales Act. Now, the significant difference between EU law and other forms of international law, other treaties between states, is first its enforceability. It creates rights that can be enforced before courts here in this country. And the second main difference between EU law and international law is supremacy. Our courts and legislatures should not run contrary policies to those that have been adopted at EU level. The Court of Justice holds member states to their commitments. Now, for Wales, EU law could be seen as posing some restrictions. The Welsh Assembly and the government cannot legislate or take executive action which in some way acts against EU law. But EU law has also provided a framework for Wales to exercise its developing legislative powers.
Diolch yn fawr am y cyfle I siarad heno ac I roi fy marn I am bwysigrwydd aros I fewn yn yr Undeb Ewropeaidd. Thank you very much for the invitation this evening. I want to focus very much on two sets of concerns that I have. We will all have our own narratives for and against, but I'm concentrating on my primary concerns at this moment. First of all, I believe that we'll be much safer and more secure through our membership of the European Union. I think we all know that we're living in a world that is very unsafe and threatening, not only terrorism on a scale previously unheard of, but also closer at home, Putin's machinations in the European neighborhood area, Ukraine and the Balkans, as well as his more recent maneuvers in the Baltics. We simply cannot take for granted the peace we have known for the past 50 years. We need to continue to stand together closely with our European neighbours and our allies. I think most of us in the room know that the EU was designed from the outset, in the days of the coal and steel community, to control the sinews of war. But it has stood continuously since then as a beacon for peace and reconciliation in Europe and in the world, for the spread of the rule of law and for promoting shared democratic values and human rights. Indeed, membership of the European Union, if you trace the period that we've had since its start and the different stages of enlargement, has seen opportunities to reject oppressive regimes and indeed Soviet control by the process of enlargement to the present size of 28. So my argument is that pooling the sovereignty of the UK and of other partner European states, both through NATO and the EU, continues to be a very small price to pay for our collective security. More cooperation, therefore, is needed, not less. And the last thing we need is to weaken our collective European resolve by fanning fear, turning citizen against citizen, feeding particularly xenophobic feelings, and further alienating and radicalizing Muslim youths. Let's be under no illusion. I'm certainly not. Putin and Daesh are applauding the current tensions within the EU as signals of strategic weaknesses. As one commentator put it very succinctly in the FT, given Europe's bloody past and troubled presence, helping to undermine the major vehicle for European cooperation cannot be a good idea. It is in our self-interest and that of our families, and especially for our children, to be a full and active member in developing the European strategic security framework and working closely with our very closest neighbours. My second concern is about the role of the UK on the global stage and the importance that the membership of the European Union gives to the role of the UK in that configuration. We are living through a period of unprecedented challenges to the institutions and values that have advanced human security, prosperity and dignity over the past decades. But British power, influence and values in the world have certainly added weight through our membership of the EU, rather than us going it alone in our increasingly interdependent world. No country in the world is alone, except possibly North Korea. Over the last 20 years, almost all countries in the world have grouped together to promote and defend their collective interests. The ASEAN, the African Union, the CARICOM, the Mercosur, and they deal and want to deal with the EU, which is the largest economic and trading bloc in the world. This is a huge asset to the UK to be involved in this large-scale capacity, and it would be, I think, foolish to throw that away in the belief that the UK can be sufficiently strong running solo. A leap really into the dark in our rapidly changing and globalizing world. There are two areas of great concern to Wales which demonstrate this power of working as a European bloc on the world stage. First, very briefly, climate change. The global agreement on climate change reached in Paris last November was a major step forward in facing the biggest environmental, economic and moral challenge facing the planet. The EU led strongly by its example throughout the summit negotiations to secure this decision. It had actively mobilized all the member states before the Paris summit to spell out their joint commitments and targets at EU level to reduce emissions in the years ahead. The UK needs to be part of the EU-wide drive to implement this Paris Agreement over the next 20 years. And we in Wales can and should do a great deal with our own distinctive contribution. Secondly, the lives of current and future generations of disabled people will be irrevocably harmed if the UK votes to leave the EU. We are already witnessing the pain of austerity, which has done great harm to the well-being, independence and opportunities of disabled people and their families. The Treasury has argued that the long-term economic impact of leaving the EU would be higher government borrowing and debt, large tax rises or major cuts in public spending. Inevitably then, unemployment will rise, causing the disability employment gap, currently standing at 30%, to widen further. But it is the vision of Britain's future, as articulated by the loudest advocates of the Leave campaign, that should be of greatest concern to disabled people and their families. This vision is of a go-it-alone Britain, not only out of the EU, but potentially outside the European Convention on Human Rights as well. This is a Britain where the promotion and protection of human and civil rights are regarded as un-British, workers' rights as a regulatory burden, laws and standards concerning accessibility as irritating red tape. In short, it's a Britain that would regard the equal rights of disabled people not as an aspiration, but as a problem again. I recognize that Britain once inspired the development of disability rights across the EU, but in time it has become more a follower. The obligations in our Disability Discrimination Act did not apply to most employers. They only applied to those with more than 15 more than 15 employees. And it was only as a result of the EU Employment Equality Directive of 2000 that all employers finally came within the scope of Britain's disability discrimination law. The choice in front of disabled people is a stark one. Vote Remain for continuing progress towards becoming equal citizens of the EU and the wider world, or vote Leave and face the consequences of being left out in the cold again. So I conclude by saying that I think we will be safer and more secure if we remain. I think we will have a stronger punch and voice at the global level if we remain. And thirdly, we will certainly be better equipped to tackle the crucial problems, global problems that we face, like climate change, as well as helping people with the rights of disabled people in particular. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for inviting me to put the other side of the argument as far as Europe is concerned. Quite frankly, I'm going to confine most of what I say this evening to the criminal justice system. And I say that because without the rights of a true criminal justice system, none of us have any rights at all throughout, whether it's with Europe or outside Europe. The basic rights and freedoms of the British people are incorporated in those two historical documents, that of Magna Carta, just celebrating its 800 years of existence, and later the Bill of Rights, and of course habeas corpus, established in the 1629 Act. We don't need Europe to give us our rights. We have had them for more than 1,000 years. Those rights include trial by jury, that we should not be arbitrarily retained, which of course manifests itself in charges having to be laid before our own peers within 24 hours. Our own peers taking the form, until very recently, of a magistrate's bench of sitting JPs. And above all, that fundamental concept of innocent until proven guilty. The administration of criminal law has been through the auspices of the magistrates and crown courts, and ultimately the Lords. That is, again, until very recently, and by recently I mean the last 30 years. Since then, the administration of criminal justice system has undergone far-reaching and fundamental changes. The most striking of these changes being that of ultimate jurisdiction. The introduction of the so-called Supreme Court in Britain is part of that process. Of course, the name Supreme Court is a misnomer. It is not a Supreme Court at all. That lies, as stated by Lord Denning, one of the country's most eminent judges, in the European Court of Justice. The notion of the supremacy of the British courts ended with the Maastricht Treaty. The introduction of the European arrest warrant sees an end to those basic concepts of British common law laid down over the last 6 centuries. There is no trial by jury, no presumption of innocence, and no requirement to prefer charges within a specified timescale. The European arrest warrant may be acceptable if all of Europe's domestic jurisdictions were the same as that of the UK. That is patently not the case. Our involvement with the European superstate not only sacrifices the sovereignty of the UK, it also sacrifices the supremacy of British law. Now, can I come to a few points made by my colleagues here with regard to the fact that it is Europe and our involvement in Europe that has kept peace in Europe for the last 50 years. Well, the truth of the matter is, most of the nations of Europe weren't even in the European Union till 30 years after the end of the Second World War. And far from keeping peace in Europe, it was Europe's acceptance of the state, one of the Baltic states, as being a sovereign state that actually caused a conflict in the Baltic regions, so that we saw that diagonal war being perpetrated there. So the fact that Europe has kept peace, that the European Union has kept peace in Europe, is an absolute farce. It does not keep peace in Europe, unless you say the Baltic states are not part of Europe at all. I'm sorry, not the Baltic states. I'm referring to the old Yugoslavian states, where we saw that terrible conflict there. So when we're talking about is Europe looking after us as far as our human rights are concerned, that again is a false concept. It is Britain that looks after our human rights and has done it for, as I say, for a number of centuries. So if we are to come out of Europe, those same human rights would stay exactly as they are today. Britain produces something like 2% of the world's carbon emissions. But all of our companies are being put under diabolical restraints in order that we should reduce that carbon footprint. What they're doing, in fact, is actually exporting the jobs that we have in this country to countries like China, which have no restrictions as far as their carbon footprint is concerned. And this year alone, they will actually build something like 1,400 coal-fired plants, and so will China, and so will India, where it will build 500 coal-fired plants. And those plants will be under nothing like the sort of restrictions that our power stations would be in this country. All we are doing is exporting our carbon footprint to another part of the world and making it even far less a possibility for us to reduce carbon emissions. So what I'd like to say to you is that our presence in Europe means that we are actually losing our sovereignty. And that is it's not so much an economic argument, it's all about who governs this country. And Europe is, I'd ask you this question. Let's just take Wales as a nation in Europe. Of course, the full name of the European Union is not the European Union of Nations. It's the European Union of Regions. That's the concept that started the whole business of the European Union. So I'm going to say to you that what person would exchange being a nation in the unity of nations we call the United Kingdom for being a region in a vast conglomeration of regions that stretches from the Baltic to the Aegean and will soon have its borders on the Bosphorus. And what nation would change 4 MEPs in a parliament of 751 that is undemocratic in Brussels for 40 MPs in a democratic parliament in Westminster? Only a few would stop those two. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks to our speakers. We now have some opportunity for a Q&A session. We have a roving mic up here with Manon. If you have questions or comments you wish to make, please indicate. I would just ask people, I know it's going to be very easy on a night like this to get hot under the collar, but let's try for a relatively even-tempered debate, and also if you could keep your questions and comments reasonably brief. But there's the comments here, I think, at the front first of all.
Can I also encourage you to use a hashtag EU Referendum on the top, so we can use your
That's if
comments and photos.
If you're using Twitter, yeah, so comment here at the front first.
Yeah, I have a question, and it's a bit back in history, and somebody was told to be around and voted at the last time we had a chance to vote at the referendum. You said at the time that it was clear that this was, we were joining a political union, that's what the EU was about. I remember at the time it was all about a common market for the voters. We wouldn't be asked to will we join a political union at all. It was clear. Now you might say the academics might think that, and even the politicians might remember it that way. But the people, the general public, certainly did not see it as a move into a political union at that time. So I just wonder, where you based your comment, you made a statement saying that it was clear it was a political union. That's what the Iron and Steel Federation was all about. But I'm sure, but I can speak for all people who are maybe around at that time, they don't remember it that way at all.
Okay, thank you, sir. Quick comment. I seem to be directed at Hill Kerry, so if you want to, respond to that first, okay, and then we'll come on.
My guess is I was around at the same time as you, I remember quite clearly that the invitation to join was to the EEC, European Economic Community, which at that stage was based upon the provisions of the Treaty of Rome. So what was being taken on board was all those provisions. There was no discussion about a political union. This has all been a fantasy of the opposition that had been invented over the years about super state and a federal project. It wasn't there.
That's the point I'm making.
Well, it wasn't. There was no engagement in that. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. In that sense, you're absolutely right. But it was to join the EEC. That was the invitation at that point, which is in 19.
So how do we get from there to where we are 40 years not on to a political to where we're integrating politically? How have we got from there to here in 40 years?
Because there have been changes in different treaties to which we signed up. One of the treaties involved a decision led by, backed fully by Margaret Thatcher and the United Kingdom government for the creation of the internal market, which was clearly recognised at that time by the British government as not giving away sovereignty, but pooling sovereignty in the self-interest of Britain. This is why the UK went along with it and was the most enthusiastic supporter. And secondly, the UK was, if I may correct my colleague here, on the history, we obviously need a history lesson because the process of enlargement involved Greece escaping from the colonials, the Franco regime of Spain, the Salazar regime in Portugal, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the absolute explosion in Central and Eastern Europe, with countries desperately wanting to share in a democratic model represented by the partnership with Europe at that point, and fleeing from communism and Soviet control. So how you can claim that that wasn't a contribution to peace and stability on a divided continent, I don't know. But could I ask a question?
Well, you talked for quite a long time, Bill Kerry. I'd like to come to the other panellists as well. Joe, do you want to comment on the question as well? Well, David will have a chance to comment on it as well.
I mean, very quickly, in terms of the legal framework, when we joined in 1973, the framework was already there. Principles like primacy of legal law have been there since the early 1960s. So, in terms of what we were getting into in terms of being held accountable to the agreements and the commitments, that framework.
I can understand that. I can say an academics probably, and the politicians probably knew that, but I can assure you, the general populace, the people who would be asked to put an X on a ballot paper, they didn't realise that's what they were getting into. I remember it well.
Well, I can actually agree with you on that because, in truth, I voted in a common market. which is what it was portrayed as. And every politician sort of talked about it, said there will be no abandonment of the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. In fact, Ribbereen got up in Parliament and said that our waters, the British waters, would never be sacrificed as far as he was concerned. The sovereignty of our waters would be sacrosanct. But of course, what you have to realise and remember is that the original perpetrators of this European concept actually said we cannot allow the people to know what we are about. We have to keep it secret, and we have to act by stealth and not let the people of Europe know exactly what we are doing. So when the gentleman says, yes, that it was all there in Rome, the Treaty of Rome, I can assure you, and it's in Hansard and said in Hansard, none of the British politicians who were advocating us going into Europe ever actually read the Treaty of Rome. You understand that? They never actually read the Treaty of Rome before they signed it.
Can we have another question? So the lady in the third row back there, please.
Peace has been mentioned by two speakers, and I'm concerned about what's going to happen in Northern Ireland. It's been, I think it's true to say that Europe has played a very positive role in helping the peace process there and continues to give considerable financial support to aspects of that. So I was wondering if you could give your opinion about where that's going to go from now.
Let's go in the reverse order on the panel this time. So we'll start with David and we'll work up to Phil Kerry.
Well, of course, any money coming to Northern Ireland, it is not European money. It's our money being returned back to us after the European Union has taken something like half of it. So it's never European money. Ignore all those little flags you see flying about the place saying this is European money. It is not European money. We pay far more to Europe than we ever have returned. Now, to come to your point, yes, I think all countries were involved and cared about what was happening in Northern Ireland, and of course, not least of all, the British people cared about what was happening in Northern Ireland, and it is a wonderful thing that peace has come to Northern Ireland. But I don't think we can put that as the door to the European Union as being the promulgators of that peace without any doubt. I mean, to say that is really stretching an argument a little too far.
Joe?
I think we'll hear, very quick, we'll hear more about the relations amongst the different parts of the United Kingdom in a future panel. But it is the case that, you know, I think the fact that we have Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland both as members of the European Union, and the facility that provides for ease of travel, for ease of commerce, for ease of daily life is a very important factor. And there are, as we know, some very real concerns about how that's going to be policed and patrolled, because we will then have a hard border that operates on the island of Ireland.
Okay.
Well, the first thing that will happen will be the reintroduction.
I think, yes.
It's because you're looking at me, that's why. No, the peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland, I never claimed that it was the EU that facilitated or propagated that. But the EU was a major player, together with the United States, in helping broker the peace. And since that time, the EU Peace and Reconciliation Program that has been running now for a long time, I was directly involved in it myself, has contributed greatly to the continuing peace process. But the speculation is now that with the reintroduction of a frontier, because there'll have to be a frontier if there is Brexit, that'll be the only frontier that people will have to cross, will destabilize the process, and certainly destabilize the peace process and will certainly mean the withdrawal of the EU Peace Reconciliation Programme that provides considerable funding, by the way, with huge support from all the countries of Europe. It wasn't a Commission ploy. There was huge support and concern about making a contribution into that peace process, and we shouldn't underestimate it. So that, coupled with other implications on these islands, in Scotland in particular, we need to weigh up very carefully.
We have, if we're quick, we should be able to get a couple more questions into this session. Gentleman at the front here.
Thanks very much. I was surprised at the claim that the European Parliament is an undemocratic parliament when the election process is exactly the same as that for the Welsh Assembly. I stood in an election in 1979, so it is a democratic parliament, and to describe it the way you did is in fact a disgrace. And on top of that, to then go on about trying to equate, say, a 457-page health legislation in Britain at the same level as a 3-page VAT fraud piece of legislation in the EU to try and get to a figure about how much we are dominated by Europe is just totally out of fantasy land. And the gentleman over there who spoke about the 75 debate being about Europe, well, I can remember very clearly Michael Foot and Enoch Powell, all they talked about was how this was a terrible political process towards a European Union. And that certainly figured very, very highly in all the debates that I attended.
Okay, thank you, sir. Yeah, two already. Take a question at the back as well, and then we'll have comments from our panellists.
Diolch fawr iawn.
I would like to
just talk loudly, David. We'll hear you.
I think it's important just to emphasise and disentangle Mr. Rowland's conflation of the European Convention on Human Rights with the EU institutions. The two are separate. This is a referendum on the latter, not the former. So I think it's important that you understand that.
Okay, good job, David. Okay, there's a couple of more comments than questions, but the panellists will come down the line from Bulgaria first. If you say you want to comment on at all, I'm sure you'll find something to say.
Well, I'd like to ask my colleague on the question of climate change, to which he referred very briefly. What would he say then is his position in relation to the implementation of the Paris climate deal over the next 20 years? Does he not want the UK to be part of the collective clout of making a huge contribution on this massive issue? Would he be against, in that context, the huge investment in research and innovation that will help us in Wales to make a contribution on that issue?
Well, perhaps let David then deal with that before we come back to Joe. David, do you want to address that or comment?
Yes, fine. First of all, let me just say this, and it might sound a complete and utter heresy, and I might be accused of saying that the Holocaust didn't happen and lots of other things, but let me just say there is huge amount of scientific evidence to show that the world is not even warming. There we go. Thank you very much. I'm glad you said that. Do you realise that can I just tell you something? In 1952, 3 submarines actually met at the North Pole. And how did they meet at the North Pole? Because the ice was so thin, they were able to smash up through the ice. An absolute impossibility today. And what I'm saying to you is this: if you look at all the scientific evidence properly, independently, you will see that almost all climate change is cyclical. They were growing grapes in Newcastle in Roman times. The Thames was freezing over on a regular basis in Victorian times. The climate is cyclical. It's as straightforward as that. So, no, I wouldn't waste our money on what they call renewables.
So do you want to comment about the question that said?
Can I just come to you about... Yes, I'll tell you why it's undemocratic, because the European Parliament is not a legislative body. It doesn't create legislation. The body that creates legislation is actually the European Commission, right? And they are not elected, they are appointed. The European Parliament simply looks at the legislation and, if it can, alters some of it.
It most certainly can stop it. And in terms of how law is made, that the European Parliament is one amongst a number of institutions who each represent different sets of interests. So we get a balance of those interests in the lawmaking process. And in terms of acts of legislation adopted by the European Union institutions, then the European Parliament has to give its approval.
I actually wrote my first two academic books.
If I can just say very, very quickly on that, what actually happens in the European Parliament is they have a huge sheet of papers put in front of them, and they're told to vote yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. I've been there. I've been there too.
Excuse me, this is not going to descend into people shouting at each other. We have last brief comments from each of the panellists, starting with Paul Kerry. No more than a minute, please.
No. But the European Parliament has co-decision powers with the Council of Ministers. In other words, all the governments around the table, co-decision on many, many areas, including on the budget of the European Union. So you're completely out of date. There's been a huge expansion in the powers of the European Parliament in the last 10 years. But my concern is that you're not answering my question, which is about the climate change and the fact that we have a global agreement. Why would all these countries be so unwise as to commit themselves to all these targets over the next 20 years to try to get a huge change in the situation? Are they in fantasy land? But my concern is not whether they're in fantasy land. My concern is, will the UK be party and a partner in that to make sure that we do hit the targets and make a contribution to bequeath a safer environment to our children?
Joe, any last comments? Yeah.
There are real concerns in relation to democracy and how that is exercised. The fact that there is not a large turnout for the European Parliament, but I don't think we should ignore the European Parliament, and we should recognise it as a democratic institution that plays a central part in the life of the European Union.
David, any final comments you wish to make?
We are the 6th largest economy on earth. If after the breakup of the empire, we didn't give all of our former colonies the ability to rule themselves, people like these on this stage today would have been totally appalled at what we were doing. So what they're doing now is denying this country its own sovereignty, whereas they would have demanded, without any doubt, sovereignty for the smallest, tiniest economies on earth.
Right, thank you. We now have, concluding with this panel, we'll have a short changeover as we set up the next panel. I wonder if I could ask some reinforcements of cold water on the table as well. In the meantime, perhaps you can join me in thanking our panellists.